Thanks, Keith. Yeah, my role here today is to give you an understanding of where we are in the province, what our status is, what we've done over the last year, but also give you an understanding of what our strategy is and what our approach is for those of you that don't know how we go about this problem of Mountain Pine Beetle and how we've evolved our program since we started it over 10 years ago when it first picked up there and down in Canmore. So what I want to do, I'll go through basically a beetle cycle of how we manage this thing. And the beetle cycle, I want to start at this time of year. Our operations, all of our control work, because our money is tied to the fiscal year end, all of our work has to be done by March 31st. So once we get into April and May, we're really just setting up for the next year. And the first step of that is to find out how well did these beetles survive the winter, what is their projected success going to be, and to highlight some areas where we think we're going to have problems in the fall and where we're going to have to focus our efforts. So we do what we call these spring overwintering success surveys. We do them in May and June. And last year, here's the results from last year of those surveys. Now essentially what it shows here, anything in blue at this time last year showed that our populations were struggling. We thought that the populations would be declining naturally because of the poor weather and the poor survival over the year. And the areas in red where we're seeing up in Grand Prairie and Peace River, these pockets where, just given what we knew about the beetles, we anticipated some fairly good growth there. We anticipated that the beetle population would be increasing. So that's where we were at this time last year. Slave Lake area, Whitecourt, and all of southern Alberta, we anticipated the populations to drop. Grand Prairie and Northern Peace River, we thought that they were going to increase. Well, as the summer goes on, our program we basically wait for the beetles to do their thing and they fly. We tracked their flight this year. They flew in the middle of August and another flight at the end of August. Not a particularly large flight, as what we've seen in the past. But we knew the other part of our program is to find out whether we get these long-range dispersals coming in from other jurisdictions or from areas in northern Alberta. This long-range dispersal is what's really been driving our program since it started. It was something we had underestimated when we first saw it in 2006, and it is really the key driver of what happens in Alberta. And so in order to detect those early, to find out whether we had an in-flight, we put a series of baits, of baited trees out in areas that are not currently infested with mountain pine beetle, and you'll see those by these squares throughout the province. And what we're trying to do is, basically this is our early warning detection system. If we start seeing a high number of beetles in these areas, well then we know that we likely had an in-flight and we can start doing some more investigation to find out how big and how intense it was. So when the beetles flew at the end of August, we checked our dispersal baits, and this is what we found. We found that, south of Hinton, we didn't notice a radical increase in beetles. This is pretty normal. Same thing with south in Rocky Mountain House, western Rocky Mountain House. We didn't notice anything unusual. And the same with the eastern part of our province. We didn't see there was no indication that we had a long-range dispersal this year. The only thing that was fairly unique is you'll notice here right up along the Northwest Territories border, we're starting to see some beetles move up there. But really, so in August, September of last year, we didn't think we had a long-range in-flight. And that is really good when it comes to managing beetles, to know that you're not dealing with these massive influx of beetles. The next phase for our program, and one of the most difficult ones, is to do the aerial surveys to detect the red trees that were attacked the previous year. We have a large province and a large number of areas that we want to survey to get an idea of what the beetles are doing. This is very labor intensive and also very costly to do. So we use several different tactics in different parts of the province depending on what we're trying to achieve. So this year, up in Peace River, we actually used aerial photography through most of this area, where we had contractors fly to a 40 centimeter resolution or just a sub 1 meter resolution, and then they look at the images and they actually digitally try to track the red trees and give us a report that way. It's fairly accurate. It's not as good as somebody in a helicopter, but it does give you a pretty good idea of an inventory of what's going on with the red trees. And up in Peace River, that's an area where we've never surveyed to any major extent since that first overflight in 2006. So last year was the first opportunity we could have to see what cumulative damage has happened up in Peace River since we first got started in the beetle program. The majority of our program in the areas where we're likely going to be very, very aggressive with our beetle control, we use Heli-GPS. meaning one of our forest health officers or a contractor is sitting in a helicopter hovering over top of small patches of trees, getting a GPS location of them. Very difficult to do. It takes about a month to do the whole province. But it is our most accurate, most detailed surveys that we get. And in areas where we have lots of beetles, we have no intention of doing any level 1 or single tree treatment. We used last year's photography in around Grand Prairie and the Saddle Hills. And other areas we use some fixed wing sketch mapping just to get an idea of what's in there, but really we don't need the details in there for our level 1 program. When it was all said and done, you could follow the results. We still have a lot of red trees, particularly in these areas in Grand Prairie, Peace River, north of Whitecourt. And overall, our estimates, we mapped about 2.1 million trees using those 4 different tactics in the province this year. Now, the big thing about that is the red trees are last year's. What we really want to know is how many currently attacked trees there are. So as we're doing our aerial surveys, the forest health officers will go on the ground and they'll do a green to red ratio, an old attack to new attack ratio throughout the province to get an idea of forecasting how many new attacks there are. And this is the results from last fall, where you'll see anything in green is showing where there's less attacked trees this year than there was previous year, and anywhere in red, that's where our populations were increasing over last year. So you'll see some very common similarities to our overwintering success and our green to red. The two overlaid. Overwintering success, we saw these 2 pockets here, south of Grand Prairie and Peace River, and a decreasing population in Slave Lake. And our green to reds, we saw a very similar trend. This Peace River country, an increase in the beetles, same with Grand Prairie, but over in the Slave Lake and down south, we saw a decrease in the number of new attack trees. So that's really good news when it comes to management, that our populations in a lot of these areas are actually going in the right direction. But to put in the context here, if you just summarize the green to red data, so anything under 1, essentially our population is decreasing. Anything over 1, our populations are increasing. And you'll see in this Grand Prairie Peace River, these are areas where we don't put as much resources in for level 1 control. Our populations are still increasing. Whereas everywhere where we've been aggressive the last several years, Foothills, Woodlands, and Slave Lake, you know, our numbers are dropping by half, which is really good to see. So, we often get asked where pine beetles are across the province, where the distribution is, and it's not an easy question to answer. But basing on these dispersal baits, our aerial surveys, and just the experience of the forest health officers in the field, we come up with maps like this. And what this shows is the black line on the outside shows, based on where our dispersal baits are and where they've been hit historically, we think that there's beetles in these areas at some level, either endemically or small pockets in these areas. The green line is where we know we have currently green attack trees, and the red line is where we currently have red attack trees. So this is our current status of beetles in the province, quite a bit different than what it was 10 years ago when all we had was a little pocket sitting down at Canmore. So we do our aerial surveys, we do the green to red analysis, and now it's time to come up with our plan of where we're going to put our resources, where we're going to put our money, and how we're going to control these trees. As many of you know, we have 2 prime objectives on our Mountain Pine Beetle program. The first one is to protect our eastern slopes, to protect those major watersheds along the eastern slopes. And number 2, prevent this thing from going further or slow the spread from going east into the boreal forest and across Canada. So those are the 2 things that we look at when we make our decisions. Are we meeting our prime objectives? And so this map here shows where our pine is in the province, and the red is our highly connected pine. Really, we make the assumption that anything in here, in this big bulk of pine in the province, any major mountain pine beetle activity in these areas will threaten those prime objectives. So this is where our focus is when we do our level 1 control program. The other major part of our strategy when we look at this is if we're going to control beetles, we want to control enough of them to have an impact on the population. Our target is we want to treat, in the areas where we're going to work, we want to treat 80 to 100% of the high-risk trees in there in order to be effective. One of the things we learned from BC is if you're going to go to the fight, bring enough tools with you to be successful. You can't just go in there and nickel and dime this thing or else you're not going to win. So right at the beginning we made this decision, if you're going to go into an area, you control enough of the trees to have an impact on the population, and hopefully that's when you'll start seeing the declines. So before we make a decision to go anywhere, we ask ourselves, can we get 80 to 100% of those given what our budget is and our capacity is? Now the definition of a high-risk tree, right now we use a decision support system to define what a high-risk tree is, and that is based on how many infested trees are in that patch, what's the susceptibility to the stand, and how connected is that stand to other pine stands around the area. Now that risk analysis has served us well for about 5 years, but we're re-looking at it now with the help of Dr. Barry Cook and Alan Carroll, and Anina is leading it with SRD, Anina Hunsdorfer. We know enough about beetles. We've been fighting this for about 10 years. We've got a lot of data. We have a lot of information. We want to see, is there a better way of defining risk? Can we use the information that we've gained over the last 5 or 10 years to really fine-tune what our definition is, and so we can be even more strategic with the money we have in targeting the highest risk patches across the province. So, we define where our high-risk trees are. We know what our budgets are going into the fall. And then it's time to divide the province into zones of where we're going to be very aggressive. And again, our most aggressive areas is leading edge zone. You'll see it for the most part follows a big band of pine that's within the province. These are areas where we want to be aggressive. Our populations are relatively small and very patchy, but the pine is very connected and very susceptible. So in these areas when we do it, we want to treat, our goal is to treat 100% of the infested trees, or the high risk infested trees in this area in red. So a fairly large chunk of the province. This area in yellow is our holding zone. It's an area that's also very connected with pine. It's highly susceptible. Strategically, it's a very important area for us to knock the beetle populations back. But either we don't have the resources to do it, or there's just too many beetles in there in order to be effective. So what we knock off some of the bigger patches of beetles in there, but we know we're not going to reduce that population. We're trying to hold it, or hold it steady until either Mother Nature helps us out, or we can start moving more resources from the leading edge zone back into this area. And then these other areas, Grand Prairie, Peace River, we don't put any resources in. This is called our inactive holding zone. They don't directly threaten our prime objectives, and the pine is much more dispersed and spotty up in those areas. So we don't put the effort into those areas. We focus our efforts down here. So all this happens in the fall. We do our aerial surveys. They're done at the end of September. We run the risk analysis. We come up with the plans of where we want to work. We get our budgets. All this happens sometime at the end of September into October. Then we meet with the industry to find out where they're going to harvest this year, and then we build our plans from there. Usually we don't start getting work until November is when our first contractors are on the ground. So November, December, January, February, March. Those months are where we ground survey and control all the trees throughout the year. And you'll see, this is what we achieved this year. In Smoky up around Grand Prairie, they surveyed 6,700 sites, just under 120,000 trees. They controlled 118,000 trees. 99% of the high-risk trees were taken out of there. And you'll see that for woodlands, 1,300. The number of infested trees is 7,700. They controlled 99.5% of them. And then Foothills, Slave Lake, Clearwater. So provincially, as of March 31st, this is where we were, surveyed about 130,000 trees, controlled about 130,000 trees, which represents 99.9% of the high-risk ones that we wanted to treat going into the season. Now we have to put this in perspective, because I really do feel sorry for the people, and you see Pam Melnick's here. But the work from Pam Melnick and Devin Letourneau from Grand Prairie, they have a lot of work to do. You can see in this graph of where the proportion of work happens in the province. And really a lot of that is sitting in Smoky for the number of trees that are controlled. They have a massive operation, a lot of contractors, that's done in a very short amount of time. And the reason we put so much effort in there is they have a lot of beetles. And you saw those R values, and the green to reds are showing that's where our populations are increasing. They get a lot of the effort and a lot of our resources. In these other areas, woodlands, Foothills, Slave Lake, our populations are much smaller. When you work with the people in BC, it can also often be very disheartening to talk to them about their experience on beetles and how they get overrun and how quickly the beetle population can grow and get away from you. We experience that as well in certain areas and at certain times of the year. And it's hard to put lots of effort in an area and then have the beetles outrun you. But we still have to keep encouraged. And I want to show some graphs here of just to demonstrate how our populations are how they work, basically what drives the populations in Alberta. And I want to use the Foothills Forest area as an example. The Foothills Forest area includes the Wilmore Wilderness area, Hinton, includes most of West Fraser's FMA, a little bit of Sundances and Weyerhaeuser's. It's in around Edson and Hinton. It's kind of the central part of our province. And this area I want to use for comparison for a couple reasons. One, we've had the same forest health officer in there all since this thing began for the most part. It's been surveyed very consistently year after year after year, and it's always been in our leading edge zone for the most part. So it's the one area that since this thing started has been treated very consistently across the province. And I wanted to show you what's happened with the number of red trees in the foothills area to give you an idea of the trends and what happens. It really got started with Erica Lee out there, so she's kind of the blame, is in the Wilmore. We started to see the beetles creeping up there in the Wilmore in 2004. 2005, we saw quite a few more come up in the Wilmore, and this is when the province, we had camps out there. We were controlling beetles like crazy in the fall of 2005 in the Wilmore. 2006, that population continued to expand, and you can see in the bottom, you're starting to see a pretty typical exponential growth of beetle populations of what you would typically see. If you remember, in 2006 when we had our first overflight, and so those trees turned red in 2007, and our story has changed. It really made a massive jump in the number of red trees in 2007, which is a result of this big inflight in 2006. So, at this time, that's when we focused our strategy. We brought in the decision support system, and we treated this area very, very aggressively. And in 2008, our numbers began to drop again. 2009, the number of red trees continued to drop. So it gives you some encouragement to see, our management practices, the environment, we can have an impact on this beetle population. The populations are not continuing to grow, they're actually going in the right direction. But then you get another big inflight like we saw in 2009. And the number of red trees jumped up again in 2010 as a direct result of this another big inflight coming in from BC. But we can't be disheartened because, again, our numbers are continuing to go in that right direction the year after. So what I want to demonstrate here is our numbers and our populations are really driven by these inflights that are coming in from other jurisdictions or from areas that we're not controlling. If we're just dealing with beetles that are growing and dealing locally, our numbers, we can have an impact. It seems like they're dropping. It's these inflights that are killing us. And we know that now that the populations in BC have peaked, they're starting to go on the way down. They're starting to run out of pine. They're starting to hit their fringe elements. This chance of these inflights is going to be less and less and less, which is just good news for our program. So I just want to finish off with a couple things that happened this year that are fairly unique for us. And the first one was we had the opportunity, we received some funds out of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers to host a workshop in Alberta for forest health professionals from across Canada, as well as forest management executives from across Canada. And what we wanted to do was a couple things. We wanted to make people across the country aware of what we're dealing with and aware of our program, and also to work with the academic community and us to understand what the risk of this thing is to go across Canada. Really to increase the awareness amongst all these other jurisdictions about what this could mean and what it's meant to Alberta. So we had representation from across Canada. We had people right from the Maritimes all the way across the prairies here. The forest health folks spent a couple days in the field with industry, learning about how it's impacted their companies, how it impacts level 2 timber supply, and just their business, as well as with our staff to talk about what a level 1 program is all about, how we set our priorities, really give them a good understanding of what our program is all about. When they went home, it was a fairly good eye-opener for a lot of these jurisdictions to understand what we're dealing with and what they could potentially be dealing with. And for me, it was important to start getting it on a national stage to get these folks starting to talk about it amongst our own jurisdictions. For the forest management executives, instead of going to the field the second day, we actually took them for a flight. We took them for a flight out of Edmonton, went over Slave Lake, over to Grand Prairie so they could see it firsthand. We wanted to demonstrate two things: the red trees that were out there and how bad it was, but also how patchy the distribution of pine was as you get further east of Slave Lake, to really demonstrate that if we're going to stop this from going across Canada, that's the place to stop it, because it's naturally broken up. So at the end of the day, that was big. That was happened in November. What that did was, we started to get some, we were already in the progress of getting an agreement signed with Saskatchewan. They announced it at that workshop that they had actually given money to the province of Alberta. So all the work that's done in that Slave Lake area is actually funded by Saskatchewan, and we're looking at building on a multi-year program where a lot of our work on the eastern part of the provinces will be funded by Saskatchewan. And now Northwest Territories is looking at the same options. They saw that beta tree, within 35 miles of the border, and starting to increase their awareness. So we're going to be aligning our dispersal baits with them this year and starting doing some information transfer for Northwest Territories. The other thing that I took the opportunity, I had the opportunity to go down to the Black Hills in South Dakota to talk about our Mountain Pine Beetle program. They're just going through a Mountain Pine Beetle outbreak now. It's just kind of getting to the point where it's being epidemic and it's not going to be able to be controlled. But they're not coordinated down in the States. They have a lot of groups there that aren't aligned with what beetles are all about. They have a lot of federal agencies, state agencies, private landowners, and environmental groups that are all trying to manage beetles, and it's very ineffective. And they're seeing what Alberta's doing and very encouraged that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but they can't seem to get the momentum to do it. But it was nice to be able to highlight our program as we go to these other jurisdictions. So with that, that's where we're currently sitting. Right now, we're in the process of acquiring funding. We'll go to our minister and look for some funding to get us going for this fiscal year. We are going to start our overwintering surveys in May till June and start aligning with Saskatchewan and their dispersal baits up along the eastern part of our province.